Warm welcome, everyone. Great to have you here at the Power Hour. My name is Tim Wagemakers. I'm your host for this Power Hour, and it's a sort of pressure cooker because we have a conference that's today and tomorrow. And in this Power Hour, we're going to do a short, concise version of some themes that are going to be more extensively discussed later. What we're going to do in this hour, we will start with a 10-minute talk by Simon Friederich, our main guest. He's philosophy professor at the University of Groningen, and he will tell us a bit more about existential risks and how we might mitigate them. Then we'll ask a few questions about his work and go to the other speakers also, because we have 3 short themes that we're going to discuss today. Some speakers who are at the conference are not here right now, but they send us a video to introduce the themes we're going to discuss. I see Susi unable to turn on video. Let's see if we can do that. I think Otto is working on that. Susi, thanks for letting us know. You can also ask questions in Swapcard, but since it's a short hour, I will read along the chat and try to include them in the talk. So that's good to know. But Simon, great to have you here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear everything. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Because actually, I would like to give you the floor to start a short introduction about existential risk. Otto already said a few things, but we're starting a whole new hour again. So the floor is yours. We're happy to have you here.
Right. Yeah. Thanks very much for the invitation, Otto and Tim, for the introduction, and great to meet you, Rumtin and Susi here, and all the watchers and listeners out there. So Otto already, from as far as I understood already, gave you a very rough overview of some existential risk. I have a kind of more general panorama to start with. Let me just see. So this is at our university we don't use Zoom. We have a different system, but I hope it will nevertheless I will manage. Is this good? Is this visible? Okay, so this is just some very rough themes, especially, of course, themes that are of interest to someone with a background in philosophy about existential risk that you may keep in mind during the rest of today and tomorrow. Let me just jump right in. I think so. One very important thing to keep in mind when thinking about the risks that we are facing today is that actually a lot of progress is happening, right? So this is just one graph from many that could be shown to illustrate this. Here is the share of the world population living in extreme poverty, which is defined as having less than $1.90 per day, and this has decreased rapidly, right? There was almost the universal condition for humans to live in until around 1800, but then with the Industrial Revolution, that has changed dramatically, and even in absolute numbers, the extreme poverty has decreased. Poverty at higher poverty lines is a different thing, but I mean overall, people have got a lot more wealthy and healthy. So I could also show here life expectancy or infant mortality or so. So a lot of good things are happening. And when we now talk mostly about the risks of specific technologies, it is clear that also these good things that have happened, they are in large part, we owe them to technology. For instance, we also owe them in large part to fossil fuels, actually. So that's, I think, something very important to keep in mind when discussing the climate problem. We will not solve the climate problem, I think, without being aware of how great fossil fuels have been for us, which is not meant as an endorsement of their continued use, right, many decades down the line. But if we want to solve a problem, we have to make the right diagnosis first. And so impressive as this progress has happened, it's still, of course, there's still a lot of horrible things going on, also in terms of poverty, right? Many children dying each day from preventable diseases. But if this continues, as we all, I think, hope it will, it's it can't continue for very long, actually, in historical timescales. I show you here on my second slide. So this is world GDP for the last 2 millennia, and this has gone really through the roof, right? Also, roughly at the time of the Industrial Revolution, though it's not clear whether that's really the thing that has made the difference. Yeah, so now it's like you see that this curve is almost exploding. And if you extrapolate this growth, which I think has been difficult to fit the best curve here, but some exponential curve does quite well for a couple of last decades and centuries. If you extrapolate that into the future, I mean, that's it hits the number of atoms in the visible universe or so, right? The number of euros annual GDP. So that will not happen, I think, right? So something will change. So in the sense that this growth will at some point stop or will be transformed into something else. Maybe, I don't know, the very category of GDP is of course tied to human affairs, and it's not clear how long these categories will be will have their grip at all. But so something will change, and that can be bad news, right? It could be that this is like an explosion before the big collapse. So there are different possibilities. The exciting thing in a way is that we really don't know, but that's also, of course, disquieting. Here are some different types of futures. This is inspired by a paper about long-term trajectories written by a large group of some leading researchers in existential risks. Well, one possible outcome in this great, it's also sometimes called the great acceleration, right? Yeah, like GDP going through the roof, but many other things also going through the roof, technological progress and so on. So one possible outcome is, of course, extinction. Or it could also be like a societal collapse where GDP breaks down and the number of humans breaks down and maybe recovers also, maybe in waves, so we don't know. But this kind of a bad outcome here, at least, is what I meant with the first point. Then I think another outcome that is actually quite prominent in political discourse without being openly acknowledged as such would be like stationarity soon. That's I think if you ask a typical member of a Green Party or so, what is their vision for the long-term future? I think it's the idea is that we live like more in harmony with natural boundaries, use more bicycles and more organic food or so, and maybe there is still some technological development, but not in the sense that it completely changes how humans live, or that we live together with machines in ways that we don't dream of, right? It's just we live in maybe close-knit communities or so. Well, that would be another scenario. But in the effective altruism community, my impression is actually that's not taken very seriously, and I think for good reason. But it's worthwhile highlighting this, right? That also the environmental movement has really a vision that most of effective altruists don't even take seriously. And then there is, of course, astronomical expansion, right? That humanity, maybe then more so, human civilization, mostly based on artificial intelligence, also expands out of the solar system, maybe even the galaxy, or technological metamorphosis. That's my last point here, right? That it's mainly we humans enhance themselves or live in symbiosis with artificial intelligence in ways that we can't imagine now today. That could, of course, go hand in hand with astronomical expansion. And then also these developments might lead to some kind of stationarity where GDP doesn't grow any further also, but it wouldn't happen as soon, I think, as imagined and hoped for by the environmental movement, right? Much farther down the road, when we have, as it's sometimes said, achieved technological maturity, right? Basically developed everything technology-wise that is to be developed for us. So, but of course, yeah, we focus here especially on the first point. I just wanted to raise also what if we don't go extinct, right? It's also an interesting question, but how could things go very wrong? There are these big four risks that are especially serious, according to many in the effective altruism community, that were also mentioned by Otto: nuclear war, climate change, artificial general intelligence, and artificial pandemics. But also, of course, ruining our potential by locking in a permanent dictatorial dystopia also could be seen as an existential risk. So maybe I should have mentioned that here as well. Any case, it's quite striking about these four how historically novel they are. I think that's also that's disquieting, right? So all these big, really big risks have. I mean, with artificial general intelligence, not even here, right? It's just we expect it to be a very serious risk for the reasons that Otto mentioned, or many of us expect it to be a serious risk. Others don't. Still, I think there is a very crucial dilemma that is, for instance, not fully acknowledged, I think, in Toby Orr's book. We want to move to a phase where things are not as critical as they are now, right? Where we are basically safe from extinction. We want to lock in existential safety, but on the other hand, we want to keep our options open and leave it to future generations to do with the world or with civilization what they want, right? They might have much better ideas than we, than what is good, right? What is really valuable, right? If our ancestors has decided about how humans should live together, they might have found it obvious that, for instance, like homosexual relationships would remain banned or so, but we know better, right? And of course, our descendants will also know better. At least that's what I expect. And so we want to keep options open, but we all still want to fix things in such a way that existential safety is somehow guaranteed. I think that's very tricky, perhaps irreconcilable. Very curious to see whether I will get any ideas about how this can be done in this conference. And finally, my last slide, what are our data points about how serious the existential risks are? So there is one very worrying, prima facie at least very worrying data point, namely, we don't see any advanced civilizations around us, right, that have tried to contact us. That's the so-called Fermi paradox, right? The great physicist Enrico Fermi came up with this thought like in the middle of the last century. It's actually quite surprising that we don't see any extraterrestrials because there should be suitably many planets that support life in the galaxy. Why don't we see them? So of course, the bad scenario is that there were many, but they all killed off themselves, right? And that would be a very bad, like would be a bad omen for us. And that could be the case, right? It would be very bad, for instance, Nick Bostrom has often highlighted this, if we discovered primitive life on other planets. We must hope basically that primitive life is very rare, because if it is frequent, that will likely mean that also intelligent life is somewhat more frequent, and that would be a very bad sign for us. So we must really hope that we don't find any primitive life on other planets. Luckily, we see that, and that's the good news now. We are very late in Earth's history, right? Earth will get uninhabitable in around 1 billion years, so we are pretty late. And imagine that we were very much in the beginning of Earth's habitability era, then that would be a very bad sign. It would probably mean that intelligent life can appear very rapidly, that the threshold is very low, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So it's actually compatible with life, and especially intelligent life being extremely rare, right? So that's a comforting data point that we are so late in Earth's history. But then, and that's another thing, I don't know, maybe good news. We are very early in overall cosmic history. I just learned this actually rather recently, but it is expected now that the universe will be habitable, right? In terms of there will be habitable planets, like for I think order of magnitude 1 trillion of years, right? And we are now like 13 billions of years after the Big Bang. So there's a lot that can happen, and maybe a couple of tens of billions of years down the road, and the whole universe will be populated by civilizations that can make great use of the universe. We just don't know at present. Maybe we could be one of the germs for this, but maybe not. So that's what is at stake. We know, who knows what the future will bring, but yeah, the history of the universe as a whole is still rather young. So much for now.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for that introduction. Maybe one quick question, just because we're in the power hour and talking about, you should, I think, try to press the button, stop sharing screen. Yeah, thanks. One question for now is I was thinking, do you think, if we talk about, for example, the existential risk of the nuclear bomb, I think this was so vivid in people's minds at the Cold War. I mean, I think we can ask to Susi whether or not we've taken steps, but okay, the debate has been going on for quite some time. Do you agree with Otto that there's actually a great momentum now to really have a sort of mature conversation about the other existential risks we're talking about? Are we in a sort of interesting moment right now?
Well, I think what Otto mentioned in his talk was that there is evidence that we live in a very special moment in history, right? This hinge of history, where I think that you mentioned that notion, Otto, like now we are at a point where individuals can be relatively influential, right? Because whether or not civilization will continue to exist for, I don't know, millions or billions of years, somewhat depends on our actions, and that will not be the case for earlier or much later humans. So I don't know whether that's true. It's tempting to believe such things, that oneself is very important, even if one isn't, right? We all have that tendency, and I am also very prone to this. So that could be a trap here. But of course, as I showed with my graph about GDP growth, I mean, it can't continue like this, right? It has started to take off, and it can't continue to grow for very, very long. So there must be something to this. And now you also asked about whether people become more aware of this. I think so, yeah, but I don't have any. It's an empirical question to what extent that happens.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Thank you for now. I'd like to introduce the other speakers. I would like to start with Roemtien Repaspoor. Welcome, great to have you with us. You're a research affiliate at the Center of Study for Existential Risk. We've already heard Otto, we've heard Simon. Simon said something interesting, which is how can we lock in existential safety without locking in dystopia? Lock in existential safety without locking in dystopia while keeping our options open, which is a sort of conditions that is difficult to balance in. What's your take on what you've heard so far?
Thanks for having me, and great to be here. Yeah, it's a very challenging and important question around how we build our future, given the many of the risks or the sort of source of some of these risks present both opportunities and downsides, right? Especially from the and so building that future, is going to be a challenging one, of course. One of the ways I think about this problem set, and I'll be going into it a bit more detail in my talk tomorrow potentially, is thinking about the critical systems. What I like to call critical systems or national systems that underpin all the risks, I mean, and even all the challenges more broadly, and also all the potentially all the opportunities. When I refer to critical systems, I'm thinking about things like the economic system, the resource systems, including food and water and energy, our knowledge systems, our health systems. All of these systems are both drivers of many of the risks that we face. And they are also the subject of many of those risks. For example, the food system is a contributor to naturally occurring pandemics, let's say, but it's also, of course, a critical system in our survival should we be faced with a global catastrophe or an existential risk. And so when we think about potentially how do we build a future that can open us up to the opportunities while not locking us in and also mitigating some of the risks, I think about those systems and think, how do we build those systems to be on which that we build the foundations that we need? And I think there's a opportunity there for us sort of globally, but also nationally and even at a community level, to think about how do we build some of those systems so that they can support us moving forward, but build them in a way that doesn't contribute to the risks. Yeah. And it also, I think, helps us take a sort of step back. Sometimes we think in a very sort of risk-based lens, as a community, as a field. It allows us to take a little bit of a step back and go, okay, what are some of the drivers of these risks? What are some of the solutions we can be putting into place at a foundational and at a systemic level? And many of those, I think, are ways to counteract some of the challenges that we're going to face around building a positive future.
Yeah, thanks for that first introduction. I'd like to go to Susi Snyder, because I think what you have been saying about critical system and how we might have sometimes drivers that we need to assess first before putting the lens of the existential risks on our heads. Susi Snyder, nice to have you here. You're humanitarian disarmament officer at PAX, and you're also the global coordinator of Don't Bank on the Bomb. Nice to have you here. I think if we talk about nuclear threats, what Roomtin has been saying about we have to look critical at the systems that have been, in place and which have made us right now looking at nuclear threats like, okay, how can we move away from this? This is a perfect example, right? Nuclear threat. Everyone wants to get rid of nuclear bombs, but somehow in the system we've arranged, it remains sort of difficult to really make progress. Or is that too easy?
Tim, you're simplifying it maybe a little bit, but that's fine. And I think the first simplification there is that everybody wants to get rid of them, because that's not true. Because there's an industry developed to support the production, to support keeping them in arsenals. There's an industry that pays for think tanks to do research around how useful nuclear weapons are, that continuously report how necessary they are. It's a big money business. So, I think that system of capitalism, that system of power over, nuclear weapons are a great example of that. They're a great example of a system of patriarchy, a system of perpetual colonialism that allows 9 countries to create a potential harm for every other living being on this planet. I mean, that's when you take that step back to systems level, I think what Roomtin was saying is really, really interesting. But I miss some of those bigger issues. You're looking at financial systems, looking at systems of patriarchy and oppression that enable this. Systems where the 54 nations of Africa don't have a say on global security, right? That's a system of perpetuating a history that's very, very, very short-lived. Simon talked about kind of taking a much broader look at the movement of time. Nuclear weapons are a 75-year-old problem, right? It's a massive problem. It still remains a massive problem. The risk of a child born today dying in a nuclear war is greater than 50%. Yeah. But when we challenge this, when we look at how we address these questions, it's not just talking about them. We actually have to do stuff too. So we can talk and think about this, and I think that's great. But we also have to move into some action and finding ways to challenge systems of governance that prevent people from acting is also part of this conversation.
Yeah. Actually, thanks for that addition, because you've also added, I think in that sense, we don't only need to dismantle the bomb maybe, but we need to dismantle the systems behind it, patriarchy, colonialism, maybe oppression, and the way we govern and have systems of governance in place. I think that this is a good start to our discussion. We have 3 themes for this short panel discussion. And the first one is about, is AI really an existential risk? And some speakers couldn't join the Power Hour, but will join the conference later. And luckily, they made a video. So for our first question, we have Claire Boine from Harvard University and the Future of Life Institute. And she made a short introduction, and I'm just gonna share my screen so I can show that to you. So bear with me. We're gonna get there now. Share. Yes, let's watch it.
In the past few thousand years, we humans were at the top of the food chain. We had the power to control the Earth's destiny. We have already changed our ecosystem, caused climate change. And all of this is probably because we've been the smartest species on the planet. For the first time, the species that may outsmart us is a creation of our own, artificial intelligence. Some serious and recognized scholars in computer science and philosophy are saying that artificial intelligence may actually outsmart us, and that intelligence or superintelligence may cause an existential threat to us. They say that this may constitute a turning point in history where there's no going back. In addition, there's the idea that if we create species that is smarter than us, there may be an intelligence explosion because that AI could create other more intelligent beings, etc., etc. Of course, when you hear that, it may seem a little bit like science fiction, because when we hear danger or existential risk, what we think about is a species that would want to take over, control the world, be evil. But that's not what we mean. There are serious dangers to AI in relation to aligning our goals with the goal of the AI system created. If you create a super intelligent AI and that you optimize it to win a war, for instance, without inscribing human values into the system, it may, of course, create an existential risk for humans. There are other misalignment problems that could arise even if nobody was badly intentioned. For instance, Nick Bostrom's give the example of the paperclip factory. If you optimize an AI to create an infinite number of paperclips, they might kill humans who try to shut them down. They might turn the earth into a giant paperclip factory that's not livable for humans, etc. All of these are actually serious risk. There's been a survey of specialists, and they estimated a 50% chance that we may reach AGI by 2061, a 10% chance that it may happen in the next 10 years. And of course, some say that it will never happen, but we still need to prepare for it. You know, most people working on...
We already started the next video, sorry for that. If we listen to this Roomtin, there is also this element of acceleration, right? If we talk about AI, for example, that this is not a process that we're just going to put checkpoints along the way and then we have the time everywhere, because, well, the analogy with the paperclip factory, the moment it starts accelerating and in a way we don't control anymore, that's the existential risk, right? That's the point we don't want to get. How can we recognize the moment where we need to take action? I mean, it's now, but if I hear Claire talk about inscribing human values into the system, I mean, systems are being built already. Can we still correct that? What do we need to do? Sorry for the big question.
Yeah, and I'll preface by saying, you know, I'm by no means an expert or even, sort of deeply knowledgeable about AI, but from my understanding and awareness, I think, you know, the comment I'll make, I guess, is that there are, you know, the risk of an advanced artificial intelligence that has a decisive strategic advantage over the human race. That is, you know, definitely the sort of the most well-formed and sort of well-articulated existential risk that's been sort of communicated and researched by the field. And it's not necessarily the only one. You know, as I understand, there's 3 other, you know, potential pathways for and scenarios where AI poses maybe not an existential risk, but at least potentially a global catastrophic risk. And a critical one being, for example, AI triggering other existential risks. And so there's some really interesting research on AI systems being integrated into nuclear weapon systems and how that shapes perceptions around first and second strike capability. So that's a really, you know, interesting sort of perspective, and I'm sure Susi will have perspectives on that. Also, you know, how AI systems, not necessarily even extremely advanced versions, but even just transformative versions of AI being used maliciously as well by malicious actors, or it potentially being trying to be used positively, but causing negative and unintended consequences. So all that's just to say is that, you know, there will be plenty of times that we are faced with artificial intelligence exacerbating risk, and we don't. It's not going to be sort of one moment that strikes and then that we were never prepared for.
Yeah.
For better or for worse, there will be moments along that journey that will where it will be very evident that AI is creating risk. It might not necessarily be existential, but even extreme or catastrophic or globally catastrophic, we will see those checkpoints along the way. And, you know, I guess the hope is that in those moments, we are building the structures and processes and policies to minimize and mitigate that risk.
Yeah. Susi, would you like to add to that? Because I think if you talk about your line of work, you already, we've had, it's only 70 years, but we've had some experience already where we've seen how technologies can exacerbate also the nuclear threat. Would you like to add something to what Longterm said?
Sure. I think that you really hit the nail on the head when it comes to the application of new technologies on old systems. That's the compound effect is something that's very it leads to many unintended consequences that we cannot predict. And that lack of predictability when it comes to nuclear weapons is potentially catastrophic, right? Predictability is what keeps them from being used. So I think that's a very good point. The other thing is that came to my mind though is the fact that these conversations tend to happen in a very strict disciplinary bubbles. And so when we're talking about, how do we identify, predict, and prevent potential AI systems from causing major problems, we look to AI instead, and look to those who work within AI fields, or maybe we stretch to big data, right? But what we're not doing is taking a much more multidisciplinary approach and look at how are other systems issues. And again, coming back to this question about systems, how are other systems issues addressed? And the tricky thing with AI is because it is quite rapid, and because things are developing in pockets that are not necessarily communicating, there's a need to build in greater transparency, to build in greater openness around that, which, coming back to my earlier point about markets and about, it kind of defeats sort of a capitalist agenda, say, let me have the best and the brightest and the now and corner the market on this. And so there's a lot of things to come at here, but questions of existential risk are never going to be easy or quickly solvable. But they are something that we can, I think, look at through a number of approaches, not least compound effect, and identifying and mitigating those.
Yeah. Simon, maybe what in this conversation already I find very valuable, I think, is that this existential risk discussion we're having is not sort of a separate bubble that you tap into, but actually everyone who's been talking has been saying you have to look at the systems behind it and also get it out of the one disciplinary field. It is a multidisciplinary field which goes about the way we organize our society. How do you respond to what you've heard so far?
Well, I can say that I found very stimulating Longterm's example of the food system as both, essential in enabling the progress and, just our life support, the progress that we have seen there, but also being a potentially source for natural pandemics. Natural, I don't know. Yeah, you know what I mean. Yeah, I worry a bit that this is like this kind of double-edged sword nature is really very, very widespread. Yudkowsky, Elisa Yudkowsky, who is one of the people who brought this discourse about existential risk review forward, writes in a paper about psychological biases that people tend to like certain technologies and then they think they have just benefits and no risks, and they don't like others and think they have no benefits and no risk. And I think and he says that's not plausible, and I think it's true, right? So what I always wanted actually to get more exposed to someone really trying, like Susi now, trying to do something about the threat of nuclear weapons. I have looked much more into the potential benefits of nuclear technology for other purposes, right? I mean, there is nuclear medicine, but of course also for energy. As an energy source, there are big advantages of using nuclear energy source because you don't need so much material, and it's quite reliable and so on. But we currently regulate it very heavily, which is maybe good, right? Because it is potentially dual use. And so I think at the moment we try to manage the risks, but also we prevent ourselves, of course, from unlocking potential benefits. So I'm very curious whether you agree all that this is typical, this double-edged nature of technology, or whether you think maybe this is just in that regard, nuclear technology is maybe unique.
Yeah. Maybe to Susi, maybe a short response on your side, and then we go to the next topic, because in this power hour we're a bit pushing it back and forward in quick minutes. Susi?
Sure. Just I agree. A lot of people do look at technologies with, some people have personal bias around tech. When it comes to issues around nuclear energy, given that there's no solution to a waste problem that exists and that has been generated and that is currently contaminating communities around the globe, where people are dying because of the whole chain of the nuclear cycle, we have to think about that a little bit and think about what are the trade-offs. What are we willing to give to get an energy source? Are we willing to give up communities? Are we willing to give up water resources? What are we willing to give for these different things as we move through in all of these questions? What's the trade-off? So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, thanks for that. Actually, for this conference, we've been thinking about, because one way we want to do is to get it out of our own bubble in that sense and talk to people and raise more awareness. And one of the questions that was coming back is the question that has also been addressed by Claire Boine for us again in a short video. And that is, some people were saying to us, isn't it all very negative in the sense that technologies such as AI and biotech also have a lot of positive effects? And how should we integrate that viewpoint into this discussion? So let's watch a short video of Claire of that. Let me go to the, yes.
Most people working on existential risk prevention are actually optimistic people, cautious optimists. Even if there is a small chance that an existential crisis may happen, it's really important to prevent it because the outcome would be so bad. However, AI and potentially AGI carry many opportunities for hope. We could use it to do good in the world. We can make it beneficial along with the Asilomar principles that have been agreed upon in 2017 at the conference organized by the Future of Life Institute. The idea of beneficial AI is an AI that doesn't just exist for the sake of existing, but exists in order to benefit humanity. And we could use AI and AGI to reap scientific benefits, to advance medical research, to distribute wealth in the world in a more efficient and beneficial way to everyone, to combat long-lasting problems like hunger in the world. And so, of course, there's a lot of hope, and in order for that to happen, it's important to make sure that we align AI and AGI with our current values.
Yeah, I think we've already touched upon that a little bit. Let me just stop the other video. Sorry, I'm trying to be technician as well as asking questions, so sometimes a bit messy. Longterm, I think we've already touched a bit on this, right? But this cautious optimism with regards to AI, with regard to technology and the way we can manage maybe existential risk. Do you share that?
Yeah, I mean, I share the view that I don't think would be many people, if any people, sort of that would suggest that the best solution is to cut off progress due to the potential risks, or to stop technological development and progress. I think the perspective that we come to this issue is mostly from the perspective of the neglectedness of the risks, that there are governments, businesses, individuals, all pursuing many activities for the positive side and to drive benefits and to improve life across AI and across biotech and across many of these issues. But there's not necessarily enough sort of views and perspectives and research and thinking on the risk side. So I think it's when it's not coming, sort of this research into this space is not coming from a pessimistic view or a doom-saying view. We don't suggest that these risks are a certainty or even likely. It's just providing hopefully a bit more balance overall. Having said that, I think if there's anything we could do better as a group of researchers and people thinking about these issues, is thinking about not just how do we avoid avoid the risks, but how do we build the positive future? Because those two things obviously are hand in hand. And when it comes to sending a message to governments, to societies for change, they don't want to just hear the downsides. They want to hear how we build a positive future. So it's a balancing act that we need to play as a community of doing what we're trying to do, which is fill this much needed gap, but at the same time presenting as much as we can a positive, hopeful, and promising message, an optimistic message, because I think ultimately we all believe in that. It might just not necessarily show itself when day in, day out we're talking about the risks.
Yeah. Simon, if you listen to that, do you agree with that?
Yes, I don't have anything very original to add.
Okay, but then maybe if I add something myself to it, if we talk about, and then we can also maybe switch to some other risk, but if we talk about technology, it's also that often, I mean, this is my simplistic sense, but I'm not a philosopher, that anytime a new technology is being developed, it's going to be used. I mean, once it's there, someone is going to use it. So if we have this whole discussion about technology being neutral, or you can use it, how can we build in from the start, when we innovate, the values that we want to be inscribed in this technology? Do we need to add philosophers to every tech team or to every government organization? What could be a way to do this better, maybe?
I think for especially actors who are concerned about a technology, I think have no way but try and shape it, right, going forward. And maybe, use, I don't know whether philosophers are the most helpful people, physicists or the social scientists or so. I mean, there is theoretically, there is of course the option of just trying to bury some technology, or trying to make it progress very, very slow. But of course, the risky aspect then is that it can be developed by actors who don't have large scruples. I don't really have a good recipe for solving this overall. But yeah, so that's I think so let's say for when in the competition of systems, right? I mean, our heart, I think my heart at least, is still a bit with liberal democracies, right? And so with all concerns about the US notwithstanding, I am not very happy if they withdraw from some technology and don't try to shape it going forward, or maybe Europe more, right? So of course, I mean, we are Europeans, but that is at least the kind of the kind of thought that I think is important in this regard.
Yeah. Susi, You have something to add to that? No? Then we're going to continue to the last topic of this power hour. It's going quite fast, I must say. And that is about the question, how can we make sure that people are not going to sit back? How can we do something about these risks that sometimes people feel, I mean, climate change, people are experiencing it right now. I mean, it's not abstract in that sense, but sometimes it's so big, people get overwhelmed by what to do about it. And we have a short clip by Matt Boyd. I also see him in the chat already participating, which is really great. He's a researcher of health technology and catastrophic risk. So let's watch his clip. Share.
Matt Boyd here from New Zealand. So in answer to the question about problems that are abstract, large, and far in the future, I would say the following. First, we actually do need to distinguish between problems that really are far in the future versus those that are merely low probability, because infrequent risks may occur unexpectedly soon. For example, the Event 201 pandemic tabletop exercise was a preparation for a coronavirus pandemic. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic was actually beginning at the same time on the other side of the Earth. But for those threats that are genuinely far in the future, we can prepare to act. We can aim to see the problems as early as possible by actually looking to the future and taking a long-term perspective. Now, this is important because many risk assessment activities at the moment really only look maybe 2 to 5 years ahead. We can also undertake problem finding activities so that risks aren't added to risk assessments after the fact. And we can improve things like social cohesion more generally, because we've seen through the response to COVID-19 how social conflict can impede response to large risks. We can similarly aim to improve international cooperation and foster states generally becoming more familiar with making positive sum decisions. We can implement also a general implementation of the precautionary principle when it comes to technological risks. And we can actively seek information and fund research in areas where we have large uncertainties. And perhaps crucially, we can ensure that there is sufficient funding available for when it may suddenly be needed. And then finally, I'd say that it's always useful to probably have a plan of last resort. And I will talk about the idea of island refuges in my talk tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Matt Boyd. Maybe Susi, if we talk about this, do you recognize the sort of constant urge to keep people engaged and to keep people active, to keep pushing the agenda of we need to be active with these issues, we need to engage and not sort of sit back passively? How do you do that in your work?
Sure. Well, this has been it's been a constant conversation, and when it comes to the issue of nuclear weapons. When we started today, nuclear weapons were brought up as something that was like we thought of in the 80s. We thought of a long time ago. My parents should have fixed this. It's not real anymore. It's not that big of a risk. And when it comes to engaging people, it's on this particular question, which I think the distinction is maybe lower probability but higher. Low probability, but still not a zero probability kind of question. It's challenging, and it's challenging because those who are willing to act are also working on a lot of other issues. And that comes back to questions around, what is the priority for whom at what time. And what are the risks that we're facing? We're in a very luxury position right here. If you look at this, if I look at my screen and I see, myself and 4 guys who clearly are not, wondering where their next meal's coming from, clearly not, concerned about their basic needs, right? And so there's yet those who come from places which are often categorized as being seen as needing to address basic needs as primary, are showing leadership on issues around nuclear weapons. They're showing leadership on issues around climate change when it comes to international systems. And I think that there's something to be said there, and that's those successes could be better related. It's those successes, the little tiny steps, the bites of the elephant, if you will, that do keep people energized and motivated. I mean, 4 years ago, yesterday, I am part of a coalition that won a Nobel Peace Prize. That was super motivating. Got a lot of people involved, and but it took a decade of intense work to get to that point, and it was not a gold watch. Thank you very much for what you've done. It was a challenge. Now you have a global profile. Now finish the job. And it's gotten more difficult. And there's a lot of stuff where we are feeling the effects of climate change, all throughout the world. It's not just a problem over there anymore. And it's tangible. With nuclear weapons, it's low probability, but should we see a conflict, it's high impact. And so it's looking at when we're addressing these issues, where are they also connected? There are human rights issues in here. There are issues around structural inequality. There are issues around oppression, colonialism, patriarchy, as I said, as well as looking and challenging those who seek to profit from perpetuating the status quo. And that's a big part of my work is and that's fun. And when people get excited about doing fun stuff, that's also really helpful. Because it's fun to call out a company for their CEO took home $28 million last year. And I was happy to get accountable. But also to really name them. Like, what the hell, Eileen Drake? What the hell? You took home all this money on profits for a weapons system that could kill me, and likely will.
Thanks for that response. Maybe, Roomtin, we're almost getting to the end. There was another element that Matt Boyd called, which I would like to ask you, because you work at the Center of Study for Existential Risk. And one of the things he was saying, like, we also need to look at funding and research. And can we, in areas where we don't know yet how the future is going to look, get organizations or governments willing to, well, actually get the money there to make sure we can do the research? How do you see that? Do you see that there is more funding maybe available? Because as Simon said in his begin talk, we're talking about an historically novel issue, actually. So do we get the funding there to really take steps?
It's hard to say in some respects. I guess the perspective I'll offer here is that, yes, these risks are novel in some sense. At the end of the day, we have to remember that we are looking at the most extreme version of risks that are already generally well known, right? We think about extreme versions of climate change. Obviously, people are aware of pandemics now. People are aware of nuclear weapons, but they might not just be aware of or understand or know enough about the most extreme end of that. And so I think in terms of gaining momentum and where research might need to be further conducted is that end of the spectrum. Okay, we have plenty of organizations and momentum around climate change. Let's make sure that a little bit part of that goes towards thinking about the extreme versions of that. Yes, we have a lot of work happening now about biosecurity and pandemics. Let's just make sure a little bit part of that goes towards thinking about the worst case scenarios. And so it's really about capitalizing on the momentum and change that's already happening on quite a few of the risks that we already think about, but just aiming it in a specific direction, or at least contemplating a specific aspect of those risks. And one thing I'll add there is, it's not just about, research is important in better understanding the landscape, the risks themselves, but research can also be pointed at the policy perspectives. And this is obviously I'm talking my own book now, but thinking about the policy aspects of these risks. And there's research that can be done and should be done on, what are the lessons learned from, how can we think about the sort of non-proliferation treaties and those sorts of arms control treaties of the 70s and 80s and think about maybe adapting them or using that as lessons learned this time for our current issues? Or what are some areas of policy entrepreneurship that we need to explore? I mean, there's research that can be done with a policy perspective, and if there's anything I would like to see the field of studies around existential and global catastrophic risk do is focus more effort on, not less effort on understanding the risk, but at least more effort on understanding how we fix these problems and what the policy options are and which ones may or may not work, and therefore which ones we can take forward.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Simon, maybe to conclude, because we're coming to the end, is there something you say like, okay, for people who are in this power hour, we've asked people to listen to this who know a lot about existential risk, but also those who are like, okay, I want to know more about this and I want to be involved with this. Is there something we've missed in this hour that you think, okay, if you're only going to watch the power hour, this should be said also, because otherwise we miss an aspect? I'm asking all the open questions to you. Sorry for that.
No problem. I mean, there is excellent literature on the diverse risks. I can mention here the website of 80,000 Hours, for instance. I mean, we can also go to the website of the Existential Risk Observatory, but 80,000 Hours has many good resources and links to specific literature. And I think there is often people construe like a conflict between doing good things now or doing good things for the distant future, mitigating existential risk, and it's not a good dichotomy. Just that is something that I also want to so one can be interested in both, support both.
Yeah. Perfect, thanks. I would just like to add, for those who are listening to this, that Simon will have a talk at 3:30 p.m. for an hour today, so that's good to know. You can follow that. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. Roomtin will talk more about the policy of existential and global catastrophic risk. And tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. Susi Snyder will talk more about her work as a disarmament officer at PAC. So please join there. And also Claire will be tomorrow at 1:30. You saw her in the video. And Matt Boyd will be tomorrow at 10. So then you have the whole schedule. And I'd like to thank Roomtin, Susi, Simon for this short hour. It was really inspiring to talk to you. And I'd like to give the floor back to Otto to maybe do some concluding remarks and also introduce the next session, which is going to start again in 3 minutes, I see already.
I think it's going to be 5, Tim. Thanks very much. So yeah, thank you, Tim, for moderating this, and thank you, Simon, Roomtin, and Susi, for your contributions to this power hour. It only adds to my curiosity about the rest of your talks that we will hear today and tomorrow. So we've now discussed what existential risks are and why they are important, and we have an overview of which risks are the most important ones according to current research: AI, biotech, nuclear war, and climate. According to recent research, the chance of human extinction in the next 100 years because of the combination of these risks is about 1 in 6. Now, I'm asking, would you board a plane with a probability of 1 in 6 to crash, or would you let your children board it? At the Existential Risk Observatory, we think it's clear that this probability is unacceptably high, and therefore we want to reduce it. Some of these risks, such as AI, engineered pandemics, and unknown risks, are not yet widely discussed in the societal debate. We think this is harmful, since it leads to lack of funding, talent, and regulation opportunities available to reduce a certain existential risk. We realize that not everyone who becomes aware of an existential risk is going to take action, and it's not always obvious what action to take, even for academics. But someone who is not aware will definitely not take any action. That's why we try to reduce existential risk by informing the public debates at the observatory. Now, what could you do to reduce existential risks as an individual, and what could we all do together? As an individual, you can donate to institutions working on these issues. Effective Altruism has a long-term fund available specifically for this purpose. If you're very motivated, you can also consider changing your career in a more impactful direction. 80,000 Hours was already mentioned, is an organization which can give you advice about that. Anyone can simply spread the message and create awareness for other people. And anyone can do their part as an active citizen, for example, by asking the politicians that you voted for what they can do about this problem, or by writing, for example, an opinion letter to a newspaper that you're reading. Some individuals can also make a much bigger impact. If you are a journalist or an opinion maker, you can create awareness. The more often the existential risk message is shared, the more people will act upon it. If you are a politician, you can also inform people and on top of that play a part in policy making. If you are an academic, you can inform students, as Simon is doing, or do research about the topic. If you are a policymaker, you can discuss the topic among your peers and perhaps draft useful policies together. And if you're a student, you're probably still in a great position to adjust your career to the most impactful direction. Now, these are all individual actions, but together as a society, we can do even more. There's a national risk analysis in the Netherlands and probably also in other countries, and it would be an easy step to add existential risks to this document. We could also introduce a minister or a high civil servant dedicated to reducing existential risk. And of course, there is the budget. The Dutch government has an annual budget of about 330 billion euros, and the total annual research budget of all existential risk research combined globally is roughly in the order of 10 million euros. So that's about 30,000 times less. So this is basically a tiny amount if you compare it to a national budget. So even the government of a small country such as the Netherlands could easily decide to double the global existential risk research or even increase it tenfold. And this could help a lot to create more clarity about what the biggest risks are and what the best strategy is to reduce them. And this research could also take place at universities or in a separate institute such as a planning bureau for existential risk, similar to the economic, cultural, and environmental planning bureaus that we have already in the Netherlands. And any action starts with informing yourself. So we encourage people to read about existential risks, for example, in Toby Ord's excellent work, The Precipice. Or if you don't have time to read the full work, you can read our website or 80,000 hours, for example. If you need more information, for example, to help you with policy or with existential risk reporting, you can reach out to the experts that we have gathered today or reach out to us and we will couple you to them. We're happy to help.